All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 9th, 1993, led by Connecticut Senator Joseph Lieberman, you remember Joe Lieberman? Lawmakers and a panel of alarmed experts denounced video games for encouraging or desensitizing children to violence. We'll get into this, but this comes in a larger context of some larger concerns, and you could call them moral panics about violence in the media, on the news, the connection between on-screen violence and real-world violence. You marry that, in this case, with concerns about kids and a new technology, and people freak out. It gets heated. So let's talk about the 1993 congressional effort to curb violent video games. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We were reminiscing about the early 90s and remembering some of these video game titles and all this stuff right before we started taping. I do want to start, though, in that larger context that I hinted at. What are the other things sort of in the culture, so to speak, about violence and media and kids in particular? Like, how do we kind of nestle this story into a larger era?
I mean, this is such a takes me back down memory lane because I remember in high school doing a whole research project on violence and desensitizing youth with video games, with music videos and MTV, even with the introduction of profane cartoons. If you think about Beavis and Butthead, or you think about The Simpsons, or cartoons that parents hate for their children to watch. This was a moment in which I think people were intensely worried that these lyrics or these images or these ideas would infiltrate children's minds and almost brainwash them into making really dangerous decisions. And I think that, it was a fear that was pretty much everywhere. I feel like it permeated a lot of our media spaces, but I definitely felt it.
Oh, the culture was absolutely rife with these fears about children. It's this era of kind of family values conservatism that bridges parties, as is the case here with Joe Lieberman, a Democrat, being on the forefront of this. But it's hearings about gangster rap. It's hearings about pornography. It's hearings about movies and television and violence and video games. And there's also just this sense of moral panic around children, particularly as there's more and more attention being paid to child abuse and child sexual abuse. This is the era of the satanic panic and stranger danger, all of these things that create a sense that the world outside your door and even inside your living room is intensely dangerous for your kids, and your kids need to be protected.
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me of hover parenting too, or helicopter parenting, where it was you couldn't go anywhere without your parents sort of being there or co-signing. Or, I mean, there's hyper surveillance, I think, is a big part of this moment. Right.
This is probably the bridge between the latchkey kids and hover parenting, right? And I think we're swinging back a little bit now. I'd like to think so. But yeah, it is interesting that this falls right in the middle there. A lot of it is also, and I want to get into video games, but I'm curious, how much of this strikes each of you as parents are always going to freak out about their kids, every generation. I mean, I'm working on a series now where we're talking about James Dean, and it's the same sort of thing. Like, after World War II, there's juvenile delinquents. And after World War II, all the parents move to the suburbs and want this quiet little life, and they have to freak out about something, so they freak out about juvenile delinquents. But so it's something about that. There's always going to be that generational freak out. But then something also, it's always seems to be related to whatever the sort of cutting edge technology of the time is, both in terms of just unease about that technology, but also that, like, more and more, I feel like a big part of it is parents can see it. Parents can see it playing out in front of them, and they're scared by it, and they're not sure, they don't have a full grasp on it. And new technology just always seems to play that role in these.
I mean, when you think about games like, I don't know, like Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty or some of these video games, I'm not sure on the dates in which all these video games have come out, but in which you're interacting in this virtual space and you're committing acts of violence or watching acts of violence be committed, and you're doing this for like hours at a time. I mean, people were binging out on these video games. I think this is the first time where parents really get concerned that, like, the kids are not outside enough. The kids are becoming sedentary. Right. The kids are getting inundated with these images. And so in some ways, it does make sense that the idea of at least desensitization would be there.
The kids aren't outside as much, but also outside is getting more dangerous as well. Yeah. And I think it's that sense of constant threat that is not just that the media themselves are a threat, but new media are amplifying the idea that this is a threat, from your local news to cable news to daytime talk shows, which become incredibly popular in the 1980s and 1990s. And they know that they're most likely being watched by parents who are at home during the day. And so they target those parents' fears, but they don't just target those fears, they help to create those fears. And that all kind of feeds upon itself in the 1980s and 1990s to create these panics, but also these big political movements, because politicians see real possibility in these moral panics and freakouts. Yeah.
Well, and just in general, this air of violence and danger being a real political tool refracted through the media. I mean, we see that today, right? Look at those charts that show how much there was talk of crime heading into the midterm election, and then immediately the day after, it drops off by 80%. I mean, I think there's a playbook there that we see in here as well, and all the coverage, because of the rise of cable news and daytime talk and so forth, of violence. Let's go to some of the specific games, and then we'll go back to this idea of kind of how we feel about this question of desensitization and inspiration and so forth. But Kellie, you mentioned a couple names. Grand Theft Auto, I think, comes a little later, but obviously as part of this conversation. It occurs to me, you mentioned Call of Duty. Call of Duty doesn't get wrapped up into some of these conversations because it's like, oh no, a game about, going to war for your country. We're fine with that. That's not real. That's great violence.
The military.
That's not violence. But it's funny enough that you mentioned that. But the two that were sort of at the heart of this 1993 thing that Lieberman stood up there was, one was Mortal Kombat, which I think everyone knows that game, and I think was like a real touchstone then and has some like these over-the-top moments of violence. The other one was a game called Night Trap, which I never heard of, and in all the articles is references to it. So I went and I looked it up. And Night Trap is a game in which you as the player observe teenage girls having a sleepover, and they're having it in a house that, unknown to them, is infested with vampires. And you watch live surveillance footage of the girls having their sleepover, but then you try and head off the vampires from endangering the girls, and you're switching between surveillance cameras, watching girls on a sleepover.
Wow.
Don't love this.
This is so problematic.
There's other stuff that they could have, and for what it's worth, it's rated as one of the worst video games of all time, in part because there was a whole, people who are listening who are really into the history of video games, I'm sure we'll get emails, but there was a whole thing about it only worked on some platforms, didn't work on others. But anyway, Night Trap, there's a nice little trivia question. What was the other game aside from Mortal Kombat that got roped into this moment? What does Lieberman want, other than to be able to grandstand about this? I mean, what does he see as government's role in all of this?
I think he sees very much what folks wanted when it came to rap music, right? They wanted warning labels, parental advisories, so that parents would have the information about what these products contained, and then they could make the choice as to whether or not to bring this product into their home. So essentially what he wants is a kind of rating system, but he also wants hearings, right? These hearings, which are so popular in the 90s, are a chance for the grandstanding that you're talking about, but also to like call these creators to account. So the heads of companies like Nintendo and Sega are called to the carpet to take it on the chin, to have these hearings, and then to respond to the concerns that Lieberman and other members of the Senate put forward.
And this is also something where you're seeing policy that is a response to this cultural shift. Oftentimes you have these moments and maybe there's like a cultural hula or whatever, but for the most part, to see laws being generated or bills being generated as a response to these video games is something that's different. And I think it's another way, too, in which these political officials can sort of like, get buy-in, get cultural buy-in.
It wasn't quite clear yet whether video games counted as speech. So there is a question as to whether Congress could have done more. Could it have outright banned some of these video games? Certainly those were the kinds of conversations going on around like Ice-T's Cop Killer and different music that was coming out at the time as well. So these conversations are very wrapped up with one another. But this idea that... you could go for a ban. That's pretty hard. Maybe we can find some middle ground and some kind of regulation, or these industries can self-regulate.
Right. And Lieberman, I think, at the time says he would have loved it if Congress could have banned these games. But, that pesky Constitution, he felt like was going to get in the way. And so instead it was these hearings. And, I think what you're exactly right, what both of you are describing, this sort of mix of legislation, but also political pressure and this blurring of the lines. And it's always been the case, but I think, this marks a moment where that just heightens more and more for all sorts of reasons. But, politicians thinking themselves as cultural figures and their ability to apply pressure, not just, push for laws. And a lot of what comes out of this, does feel like it's a product of cultural pressure in the sense that, like, Beavis and Butthead, for instance, we name-checked them earlier, but there's an incident in which a young boy set fire to his family's mobile home, and the law enforcement blamed Beavis and Butthead, and MTV removes all instances of Beavis saying "fire, fire" in all, which is one of the catchphrases, and they put in a disclaimer in the show. And so, that's cultural pressure. There wasn't a law that forced them to do that, but it sort of raises the temperature in this conversation. There's some serious stuff that happens in the hearings. One interesting thing looking back at how the hearings play out is also that it sort of becomes a platform for the Sega versus Nintendo wars, because both the head of Sega and the head of Nintendo are both called before Congress, and they spend much of their time just like talking smack about the other company, and they're clearly going, toe to toe. So it's just very funny that they also get a chance to grandstand.
Yeah, it's like having Coke and Pepsi for like obesity hearings or something like that. And the height of the Cola Wars is having Nintendo and Sega both sitting side by side at this moment. Yeah,
the head of Sega, especially this game Night Trap, which is sort of a disaster, throws in some digs about how bad Night Trap is, not just as a sort of product, but as like a botched rollout, and it is very fun. But the other big thing that happens, and it gets back to some of the stuff we've sort of hinted at, is there is this conversation and there is some like quote-unquote evidence that's brought forward and sort of a real look at the link between violence in video games and violence in the real world. And of course, this has parallels to music and movies and all sorts of other things. And so, kind of what's our sense of the evidence at the time and how it gets used and sort of what our understanding is of that? Very tricky question.
I would love to see the data on this, because when the American Medical Association says that television is responsible for half of the murders in America, I'm like, what? I'm not buying this. I'm not buying this at all. But I mean, like, I think that there's so much like hysteria about how TV has this brainwashing function to it, or hypnotic function to it, that when people see it or watch it, that they're somehow influenced to do these really, heinous acts. I just don't think there's any data for that.
And also it's so much easier to blame television and music and video games than to look at the causes of violence in a culture, including a culture that is awash in guns. This is also
Yes.
a period in which there's a little bit of regulation going on around assault weapons, but also that is awash in celebrations of war and the military. The U.S. at this point has just come back from a war in Iraq, the first Gulf War. And so it's so much easier to just say, well, it's video games, instead of saying we are a country that is kind of in love with force and in love with guns and in love with this really violent culture. And it's really hard to extract, that video games are the cause and television is the cause and not a martial society.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And it is interesting. You're right that it's almost surprising that there actually is, as part of this larger conversation on violence, there actually is one of the last real effective gun laws that was passed in this country. The Brady Bill goes through around the same time, and it's sort of in response to some of the same questions about what is going on with this culture that is awash in violence, as you put it.
But it's interesting, too, because it doesn't have to be violence in order for children to be persuaded, because you get these arguments with like Power Rangers, which are like superheroes, and kids like beating up on their siblings, or like Spider-Man and a kid trying to like scale a building, or like there's all kinds of things that aren't necessarily intended to be violent, but could possibly have influence on children's ability to imagine and think of themselves as being heroic.
Yeah. And I just want to ID, and I don't have an answer here. This is such a thorny question, but I want to ID that we've been using words like influence and desensitized and inspire, and somewhere in there are some of the sort of most critical and blurry lines, right? And so, I would be open to an argument, and I think in the way that you described, Niki, of like desensitization is something to be concerned about, and a kind of larger question of like how are we awash in violence and what is that doing to us is absolutely a worthy question. But the inspiration, and you see in these moral panics, you get these specific instances of, this person played this video game and then they ran out and they did this thing, or they watched Beavis and Butthead and they burned their house down, or they... And
contemporary studies suggest that there isn't a clear link between violence in video games and violence in real life, which we should also underscore.
A lot of those studies, as Kellie pointed out, that were presented there or discussed in the 1993 hearings, that was one of the first times actually where people were started to be like, a lot of these studies are pretty bogus too, right? So at the very least, there's a chance to air that, right? So coming out of this, we get the Video Game Rating Act of February 1994, and it's a bill that calls for an executive-appointed panel to develop a rating system for the video game industry. There's a ton to be said about that, but that is the tangible outcome of this, and it strikes me as not an unreasonable outcome from, probably unreasonable moral panic.
I mean, fine. Consumers should have more information about what they're buying. So it's like the FDA requiring labeling on food. It's good for people to know what they're getting when they buy something. That doesn't mean that it's an entirely impartial panel. I don't know enough about it to know if things that are rated E for everyone are biased in a particular sort of way. But having information at hand when you're buying something seems particularly helpful, and banning guns also seems like it would be helpful. Which they also did in 94, right?
Yeah.
The federal assault weapons ban was in 94.
So much easier just to slap a label. I mean,
right. It's literally slap a label, check a box.
Is that gun labeled E for everyone?
Right, exactly. I know, right? Yeah, really.
So, and then, funnily enough, and sort of going back to some of the stuff I was saying earlier about kind of how there will always be generational panics and there will always be concern over the latest technology, Lieberman himself, come the last few years, when asked about this, has sort of said like, well, we did what we could and we got the labels, and, I've sort of moved on, and now I'm a little more worried about social media and the internet and all these things, which, again, absolutely, I think that's a conversation to be had. But I think more than anything, it proves with every generation there will be this panic, and whatever sort of is at the cutting edge of the technology at the time will be the focus of that panic. So these days it's, it continues to be all these things, but now we get social media on top of it as well.
Moral panics will always be with us.
Yeah, they will.
For sure.
Which means that we have plenty of episodes to do.
That's right.
There will always be new episodes. We haven't done the Tipper Gore music ratings, have we?
No,
okay, we gotta
need to.
get into that for sure. Okay, well, there we go. But That brings us to the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
We're disgusted by this material, and yet it is a measure of our values in this society that we resist the impulse to do what I think, let me say for myself, I'd like to do. I'd like to be able to pass a law saying you can't produce this stuff anymore. We don't do that because we value our freedoms. But with those rights that the producers of video games, in this case, have also come responsibilities.
Radiotopia.